Magical time. Hello, good day, and welcome everyone. It is a fantastic Friday. I'm Stacy Livingston Hoyt, session presider. Thank you for joining this talk led by Dr. Barbara O'Neill, who is no stranger to the entire AFCPE community. She has authored 6 books and is the owner, CEO of Money Talk Financial Planning Seminars and Publications. She writes, speaks, and reviews content about personal finance. Dr. O'Neill is a distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University. She has written a vast number of articles for academic publications and received over 35 national awards and over 1.2 million in grants to support financial education programs and research. So I am sure that you are all ready to absorb the content and participate in a vibrant chat today. So thanks again for joining in. There is files downloaded for you. It's available in the files section. And with that, Dr. O'Neill, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Stacy, and thank you to everybody who's here today. Last time I checked, there were almost 200 people that had registered for this session, so we should have a great group today. So what I'm going to be doing today is presenting some action steps from my brand new book called Flipping a Switch. It came out in August, and it's all about the transitions that people make in the last third of their life. If you want to know more about the book publishing process, I would just recommend that you check out the on-demand session that I co-recorded with Axton Betts Hamilton, and that will walk you through our experiences in actually becoming authors of books recently. So my inspiration to delve into this topic, I always like to have a backstory to my workshops. So as many of you know, I left Rutgers University at the end of 2019 and transitioned to becoming a full-time financial education entrepreneur. So I had that lens of knowing that I was kind of moving on to another phase of my life. And I happened to go down to the American Savings Education Council meeting in July of 2018. And Lori Lucas, the CEO there, was doing a presentation about spending in retirement. And most of the presentation had to do with people who were in financial distress because many people really haven't saved very much and Social Security isn't a whole lot. And it was kind of a gloom and doom picture. But at the end of her presentation, she said that there was a subset of retirees that had a unique problem, in air quotes. They saved their whole life, they're not comfortable spending, and their assets are just going to keep on growing. And at the end of that presentation, Lori said, we need financial education to teach people how to flip a switch from saving to spending. Okay. And then as I got closer to ending my career at Rutgers, I realized that there were lots of switches that people had to flip, not just going from being a saver to a spender, but also things related to your lifestyle, your relationships, housing decisions, and many more. So I'd like to stop here and just ask you all a question to put an answer in the chat. What do you think will be the biggest change or transition in the last third of your life? So think personally. What do you think is going to be your biggest transition when you maybe step away from your primary career? What is going to be that challenge? And if you can make it even more specific than retirement, obviously retirement will be on many people's horizon. So I'm seeing an unknown health crisis, a daily schedule, spending money from a 401k, social activities, learning to live on less, income changes, a whole worry about dementia for yourself or a spouse, living on less, motivation. Okay, lots of issues. And that's what I did. I wrote a book about all of these issues that you're all talking about because I looked for a book. I was looking for a book to help me make the transition, and I couldn't find it. And so I decided, well, if I couldn't find it, I was going to have to write it, because the process of writing a book would force me to really delve into the literature, both the blog literature and, of course, empirical research literature as well. So what I realized is that people have these multiple switches, and some of the transitions that people have are like on and off switches. You know, you do one thing one day and something the next. But a lot of the transitions that people make in the latter part of their life are like a dimmer switch. So you're kind of turning it and gradually changing over time. So, for example, working, many people will go through kind of a phasing out of their work hours, maybe 40 hours down to 30, 20, and so forth. People often do that with spending. You know, we kind of go from the go-go years, maybe in early, later life, and then maybe not as much spending when people get a little bit older. People often change their investment asset allocation as they get older. And they downsize. And for most people, downsizing takes time. When I moved from New Jersey to Florida, we had 30 days of garage sales before we really downsized to where we got to what we had left we were taking to Florida. And then there's a whole process of disengaging from things that were in your previous life to engaging in new activities that are part of your future going forward. And then another big issue for many people is simplification. And that can be simplification of how many possessions you own, how many bank accounts, IRAs, a lot of different things related to personal finance. So we have a lot of these light switches, whether they're on, off, or kind of a dimmer switch. So as I wrote the book, I started to flesh out all the different areas where people make changes, and I divided my book into 3 sections. So there are 15 chapters that deal with financial transitions, 5 chapters that deal with social transitions, and lifestyle transitions also has 15 chapters for a total of 35. And you've got the link to my book. And I'm pretty obsessive about Amazon. Like every hour I'm checking the rankings. So if everybody orders my book at the end of this workshop, maybe I'll get down to #1 in personal finance. But your ranking only lasts for an hour and then they change it again. Just kidding. But that's a little bit about the layout of the book. And I do want to say that the book was written from a place of privilege, because I was really writing for the people who had saved a lot of money and were having difficulty spending it down. But I wanted to acknowledge several times throughout the book that many people are struggling. And we know from the latest retirement confidence survey that 1/3 of workers have saved nothing for retirement, 35% have $25,000 or less saved, and of that percentage, 18% have less than $1,000 saved. So many people will be struggling. The book was really written more for people who had financial resources, and of course, those resources gave them options in their life. So I'm going to hit 20 of the 35 chapters, just talking about some of the action steps that were related to the topics of the chapters. So the first chapter in the book is, if you don't spend your money, somebody else will. And that could be heirs, it could be charities. If it's mismanaged, perhaps there's fraud involved, possibly excess taxes going to state governments or federal government. Somehow others will spend that money. So what the first chapter talks about is spending outside your comfort zone. There's something in the research literature that I found when I was writing the book called the habit formation hypothesis. And what that means very simply is that you get used to a certain level of living. And if you've always been a frugal person, as I have been, it is difficult to all of a sudden kind of flip that switch and suddenly not be so frugal. So it's going to take some practice to step outside your comfort zone. One of the ways you can do that, though, is to ask yourself some hard questions. You know, why did you amass all your savings for later life if you aren't going to spend it? And if you don't spend your money, who will? And then another question is, what are you waiting for? So that's kind of the first issue there. The second one I'll talk about is deciding when you have enough. And that was something that Carl Richards kind of alluded to the other day in his presentations. And probably the best way to know is to just put some numbers down into a spreadsheet or a calculator and do the math. So look at some of the savings calculators. I really like the FINRA retirement calculator as a tool to figure out how much you might need based on the assumptions you want to make about your future life. You may want to hire a financial advisor. Many people, either with an advisor or on their own, will use Monte Carlo calculators to kind of gauge their probability of having their savings last the remainder of their lifetime. So there's different ways to decide about enough. The third thing that's related to finances is creating a paycheck. And of course, paycheck is in quotes, because if you're not earning a real paycheck, if you've stepped away from the labor force, you still need to simulate the regular income that would come with a paycheck. So people can do this in different ways, setting up automatic withdrawal plans, for example, with mutual funds. Many of us have been used to having automatic deposits go into stocks or mutual funds. Well, you can also set up automatic withdrawals and specify a certain amount that would come out on a certain date in the month, for example. Or people can create a bond ladder or a CD ladder and set themselves up, maybe making bond purchases or CD purchases in a sequence. And then that sequence, if you did like 6 months in a row buying bonds, then because they pay semi-annual interest, you would have income coming in from the interest every month. Some people will convert a lump sum into an annuity. And then the other thing I talk about in that chapter is amending the 4% rule. You know, the 4% rule is a guideline, but it's not set in stone. And some people will amend it down. And many people, some of the more recent research is actually suggesting that, because we've had such low rates of interest and still currently do on fixed income securities, that something in the neighborhood of maybe 3.5 might be more appropriate. Or if you're a very conservative person, also you want to have less than 4% as a withdrawal percentage, because your money isn't going to be growing as fast. The 4% rule was based on the premise that you would have at least 50% of your portfolio in stock. And yet, on the other hand, if there are people that work until they're like 75 or 78, you could probably go up beyond 4%, because the 4% rule was based on the 30-year payout. And if you're starting late to the withdrawal game, you may not have that 30-year life expectancy. Okay, then there's required minimum distributions, and I call that the mandatory flip switch in the book, because it's required by law. So some of the action steps there are just learning the rules. Now, of course, RMDs were suspended for this year, but they're set to come back next year for people who are age 72 and older. And then the other thing you'll want to do is have an RMD spending plan, because there's basically three things you can do with RMDs. You could either spend the money, you can gift the money, or you can resave the money and put it in another type of savings vehicle. You have to take it out, but then you can put it somewhere else. You might also want to consider qualified charitable distributions from traditional IRAs, and they can start as early as 70 and a half. And then just getting help when needed when you start taking withdrawals. And then there's the whole issue of later life investing. So I recommend that everybody assess your risk tolerance. And the best tool that I know of, now I am biased because I worked with the people who created it, and we had it at the Rutgers website for many years. It's been transitioned over to University of Missouri now. It's the Grable and Litton tool that's been around. About 250,000 people have taken this risk tolerance assessment, and it's used quite a bit in research. So assess your risk tolerance, rebalance asset class weights periodically. I personally do that in my 403B plan. It's set to roll to rebalance actually next Monday because it's my birthday. So that's the year. That's the day of every year that it rebalances. And then beware of free mail seminars. And I'll talk more about that when I talk about fraud. And then another change is adjusting to changes in income and expenses. So people's income will either go up or down in later life. And if in that chapter of the book, I primarily talk about going down because in chapter 1, I talked about people who had quite a bit of money that they had to spend down. So some people adjust by working longer, spending less, possibly doing some geographic arbitrage, which is kind of what I did, where you move from a high cost state like New Jersey to a lower cost state like Florida. And then sometimes people will tap their home equity as well. So using a reverse mortgage or a sale leaseback arrangement with a family member. Okay, tax withholding. That also can change in later life. So people may need to request income tax withholding services on some of their sources of income, like a pension. You'll need to determine your new marginal tax rate. And sometimes with the RMDs and multiple sources of income coming in, you can actually be in a higher marginal tax bracket when you leave your job than you would be when you were working previously. So sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes the other. Timing elective cash withdrawals becomes really critical, so you make sure you're not making your tax situation any more worse than it might already be. And if it does get complex, this is probably a good time to hire a tax professional that can advise on the ways to legally pay the least amount of tax that you owe. And then sometime during your 60s, you're going to become a Social Security beneficiary. Some people will claim benefits as early as 62, and we've seen some of that this year as a result of COVID when people have been laid off and haven't been able to get a new job and can qualify for Social Security. There's been some of that early claiming. Another thing to consider is making estimated payments for Social Security. If you don't have the tax taken out, you'll need to estimate payments and make those quarterly payments to the IRS to cover your tax liability on your Social Security. And then beware of the earnings limit. If you claim early before full retirement age, it's $18,240 this year, and it's set to go up a bit next year. And then importantly too is taking care of a spouse. And often that strategy involves extending the work time frame of the higher spouse to earn as high a benefit as they possibly can, and then having at higher benefit also be able to be available, prorated of course, for the lower earning spouse. So again, people have to look at the comparative income earning ability of the spouses and the ages, of course, of spouses in an older couple. And then there's healthcare transitions. So in the book, I talk about you get 2,500 extra hours when you leave a full-time job. If you think about 50 weeks, let's say you had 2 weeks off of vacation, so you have 50 weeks, and let's say you were working and or commuting 50 hours a week, do the math, that's 2,500 extra hours. So that's a lot of time to take care of yourself. And there is research that suggests that when people have more time, they do a better job of taking care of themselves, more physical activity, healthier diets, that sort of thing. You'll want to earmark part of your nest egg for healthcare. In the book, I had the statistics from the latest Fidelity study that was done that found that a couple, both age 65, could expect out-of-pocket costs of $295,000 for the remainder of their lifetime. So that's a lot of money. That's all the deductibles and copays and everything else that's not covered by insurance, and it does not include long-term care. So people need to have some money set aside for that. And then, of course, you're going to be learning about Medicare and the supplements that go along with it. And another thing that I learned from my brother is to expect sticker shock if somebody is transitioning from an ACA plan that had premium subsidies and then they age out and then they have to transition over to Medicare and start paying the Part B premium. They may actually be paying more for their health care once they turn 65. So each situation is different, but it is something some people face. And then there's the whole transition to Medicare. So just getting educated on Medicare, getting help when needed. In most states, they call the program SHIP, but down here in Florida, and I believe South Dakota, and there may be a few others, they call it SHINE. But this is an agency usually associated with the County Division of Aging that has trained volunteers that can help people looking for Medigap policies and also long-term care insurance policies. So it's a great place to get help. And SMP is also a great agency. They deal with Medicare fraud issues. You want to keep good records of your health care. This may be the first time in a person's life where they're getting their health care expenses paid from multiple sources. You know, Medicare paying some, a plan paying some, you paying some. So it really helps to have good records of the costs that you have and where the dollars are coming to pay for those costs. That's really important. And then another planning thing for people in higher income groups would be possibly making some adjustments to household cash flow to avoid having to pay what they call the IRMA payments for Part B and Part D. When you have a high enough income, you'll be paying extra premiums for those. And then you'll be setting new financial goals in the latter third of your life. You know, when you're working, you have through retirement goals, you know, get yourself to retirement. But then once you're there, you're going to have through retirement. I mentioned it should have been to retirement before. So you're going to change from to retirement to through retirement. And this is a time where you may want to consider the upgrades that I was talking about before, if you can afford it. Maybe it's okay to fly first class sometime or go to orchestra seats instead of, you know, in the back of the theater. You know, these are the times to possibly do that and set some goals to do that. And that way you can kind of convert your spending plans into action plans and automate too. One of the things they mentioned at that ASEC meeting is that the reason why it's so hard for people to spend down their savings is because it psychologically feels like a loss. Even though it's not a loss, it's not like a stock market loss, but if you're withdrawing money from an account, you're still going to have a smaller balance. And psychologically, that's very difficult for people. So anytime you can automate spending and gifting, and then you don't have to feel that loss as often, that can be useful for people. Simplifying and organizing your finances. So this is the time of a person's life you definitely want to have a financial inventory, possibly consolidating like assets. So that could be mutual funds. If you have 5 growth mutual funds, you really don't need that. Or if you have multiple IRAs, you might want to consider some consolidation, which would make the RMD process easier. And also maybe culling some automated payments. And this would apply for COVID right now too, you know, because people aren't going to gyms. If you're not commuting or you're working at home, you really need the satellite radio. These are some of the things that people might want to consider dropping from their cash flow. And then there's a whole chapter in the book about you can't take it with you. And it's all about philanthropy. So checking out potential charities, possibly talking with charities and specifying a purpose. I mean, that's exactly what I did with the Mary O'Neill grant with AFCPE. I told AFCPE I wanted that grant to be used for an impactful project that helps real people. It wasn't a travel grant. It was a grant for a project. So you can do that with charities. You can tell them what you want, and then you can plan your donations. On my website at Rutgers, We actually have a gifting budget worksheets that you can use and have your A charities, your B charities, and so forth. And then also taking advantage of ways that you can get a tax benefit for your charitable contributions. And some people are doing that now through bunching, through the qualified charitable distributions I mentioned before. I personally set up a donor advised fund this year as a way to make charitable donations. Some people will use trusts. And then becoming fraud bait. So just use caution with the free meal seminars. I actually attended a few of them undercover in January and February before COVID hit. I couldn't ever do that in Jersey because too many people knew me from my newspaper column and my work in extension. But here, nobody knows me. So I went to a few of them, and they were rife with all of the things that I always read about, the wild promises and, doing everything possible to get your contact information. And just be really careful with that, because there is research that suggests that they can increase the likelihood of somebody being a victim of fraud. And then recognizing the red flags of fraud, guaranteed returns and the like. Be aware of all the tech scams that are out there. That's another big issue for older adults. And of course, never signing anything with blank spaces. The last chapter of my financial section has to do with achieving financial peace of mind. So again, doing things like the Monte Carlo analysis can help, spending projections, coming up with a plan for long-term care, whether it's insurance or self-insurance, and then savoring the financial independence. I mean, that's what people have been talking about a lot this week, is financial independence. And when you get there, you want to savor that. Okay, I have a few more as we wind down. In the social and lifestyle sections of the book, some of the things that I talked about were answering the what do you do question. And if you don't want to use the R word, as I personally don't do, go out of your way not to use it, because there's something called social clocks. This is where people impose their social clocks on you. So they say something like to a 20 or 30-year-old couple, well, why haven't you had my grandchild yet? That's imposing a social clock. And with an older person, it's like, when are you going to retire? So, dodge the words. If that's not in your mindset, if that's not what you want to do, don't do it. I found some fascinating research that showed that you have an easier time transitioning into later life if you have some what they call identity bridging. In other words, you carry over things from your pre-retirement life to your post. So whether it's work, volunteer work, blogging, professional association memberships, that helps people, because you're not going cold turkey into a new lifestyle. You're keeping some of the old as well as adopting some of the new. So continuing your valued commitments, and then having a new elevator speech. So when anybody asks me what I do, I say I'm the CEO of a company called Money Talk. I write, speak, and review content about personal finance. So you can say that in an elevator. There is a chapter in the book on successful solo aging. Sometimes this is referred to as elder orphans, but there's been a lot of pushback on the term, so I went with the positive term. These are people who are going to be aging alone. They don't have children, they don't have a spouse, they're really on their own. So some of the things I talk about in that chapter are the necessity of expanding your social network, getting a medical alert service, possibly doing some buddying up, like all of the Golden Girls, consider it a continuing care retirement community, or CCRC, and then possibly leaning on professionals, although there are limits to how much professionals will be able to act in the capacity of, what a child might normally do. There's a chapter on finding fulfillment, and notice find is in caps because it's my answer to fire. You know, I don't think what people are looking for is FIRE, financial independence, retire early. I think they're looking for FIND, financial independence, new directions. So I just encourage people, don't leave work without a plan. It doesn't have to be a work plan. It could be volunteerism. It could be, um, you know, watching grandchildren. It can be whatever your plan is, but leave your full-time job with a plan. You'll be a lot happier. And if you do plan to come back to the workforce, but step aside a little bit, don't step aside too long. I talked to numerous people who said the maximum you can be away from the workforce and try to come back is 2 years, because you'll just be considered rusty and irrelevant if it's much longer than that. And cherry pick the work that you like. You know, I decided I was going to keep blogging, but I didn't want to do any more work in research. So I cherry picked. And do expect some ageism, and we certainly saw that as I was writing the book. Okay, Boomer came out as kind of a saying. Okay, two more. Green bananas, roll calculations, and laughs. What does that mean? Well, I lead into this chapter by saying when I was in my 40s and my mother was in her 70s, mid 70s, all of a sudden when I came down to Florida to visit her, she kept using this saying, well, at my age, at our age, talking about all 70-year-olds, we don't buy green bananas. And I thought it was just a strange phrase. I said, Ma, what do you mean? It was her way of saying, well, I may not live long enough for the bananas to turn yellow. And I'm like, what do you mean? And now, as somebody who's in my 60s, I get it. You know, your time orientation changes when you get older and you're in the last third of your life. You start playing the math. And so ROLL is my acronym for return on life expectancy. And you start asking questions like, who's going to live longer, me or the dog? Or you start thinking about last. Will this be my last car, my last cruise, my last whatever? And it's a different time set. So something to be aware of. You know, think about that if you have older clients or older parents, they're viewing time a lot different as 60-plus-year-olds as somebody who's maybe a 30-year-old. And then finally, the last chapter was informed by COVID. As I was getting toward the end of the book, COVID was hitting hard. When I did the last review of the book on May 31st, we had just crossed 100,000. Now we're at 250. So one of the things I talk about in that chapter is accepting your vulnerability. You know, when they first started calling 60-year-olds elderly, I was like, what? I'm not elderly. But I came to realize that, you know, your immune system does change and you are more vulnerable. And I see a lot of people around where I live doing everything they possibly can to stave off disease, delay any kind of chronic disease that might come up. So you want to follow all the healthy lifestyle recommendations, get the recommended vaccines and screening tests. And then finally, one last slide that I added this morning, because I think it's also germane to the conversation, is that many of the things that I wrote about in the book that are transitions that people are making in later life are the same exact transitions that people have been making since March as a result of COVID. So think about it. We have people in this country who've had an increased or reduced income because of COVID. They've tried to create a paycheck through public benefits, unemployment insurance. A lot of people have lost their daily time structure. Of course, all the new frauds that we've had as a result of COVID, keeping busy, adjusting income taxes, answering what do you do when you've lost your job. Too much togetherness in a lot of families, that's been an issue. And of course, many people have had to reach out for help, some for the first time ever in their lives. So as you think about these transitions in later life, some might say that COVID could actually be a preview, if you will, a dress rehearsal for what people might be experiencing later when they get older. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there, Stacy. I don't know if we have time for a few questions. They'll probably cut us off soon, but let me know.
Yep. So we're you know, folks have been chiming in the chat pod and basically, you know, sharing their own experiences and
Great.
ideas and so on. We don't have time for questions, unfortunately. I think they're going to cut us off in just about a minute, but
Okay.
lots of birthday wishes, Dr. O'Neill. So happy
Thanks.
birthday.
Thanks. On Monday. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think folks are just appreciative of the information and will use it not just for their clients, but for their own personal planning. So thanks so much. We hope you've enjoyed the talk today. And any final words?
Me to the audience. Well, if you want to buy my book, I'd certainly encourage you to do that. Otherwise, if you go to my website, which was listed on the first slide, I have a lot of podcasts and webinars that are longer than this one that I've recorded. And if you want to learn more, you might want to check those out.
Okay, fantastic information. Have a great rest of the conference. And again, thank you, Dr. O'Neill.